Welcome to the People Dividend. I'm Mike Horne. Over the past several years, I've had the opportunity to sit down with founders, CEOs, executive coaches, researchers, authors, and leaders from a wide range of industries and backgrounds. Some of them have led global corporations, others built companies from scratch. Some approached leadership through operations, some through culture, some through strategy, and some through personal experience. What's been interesting to me is that while the language changes and the industries change and the individual stories change, certain ideas keep showing up. And in many ways, that's what the purpose of today's podcast is. The ideas that keep showing up aren't because people are repeating one another, but it's because some truths seem to survive experience. As we head into August, we'll be revisiting several conversations from the archives. And before we do that, I wanted to take a few minutes here at the end of July to reflect on some of the ideas that continue to shape how I think about leadership, organizational performance, and the people side of business. And the first idea that I'd like to share is that organizations drift before they decline. I don't think I've ever interviewed a leader who described organizational failure as something that happens all of a sudden. Sometimes that's how it looks from the outside. Revenue drops, customers leave, there are key departures, and performance deteriorates. But when you really listen carefully to the story behind those outcomes, the decline usually begins much earlier. It happens when people stop speaking candidly to one another, when leaders become less curious, when teams become more protective, meetings become less productive, decisions begin to take much longer, and trust weakened. That's organizations in drift. One of the challenges for leaders is that drift is often difficult to detect when you're living inside of it. It's much like organizational culture, much more helpful to have an external resource to help you understand organizational culture. In organizations that are drifting, you may still have a dashboard that looks healthy. You may have numbers that are still acceptable. The strategy might even still make sense. But underneath the surface, just like that iceberg, that proverbial iceberg, something has changed. Over and over again, what I've learned from guests on this podcast is that many of them are describing the same phenomena of this drift. Performance problems are preceded by alignment problems, and alignment problems are often preceded by trust problems. And to take it way back, trust problems are often preceded by small moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Leadership requires paying attention to those moments before they become larger issues. A second idea that continues to show up on the podcast is that execution exposes leadership. I'm living through an experience now of that very set of circumstances that organizations rarely suffer from a shortage of ideas. Many of the organizations, most of the organizations I work with have strategic plans, they have goals, they have initiatives, and they certainly have priorities. The challenge is rarely for leaders inside those organizations to decide what should happen. The challenge is getting it to happen. I think that's one of the reasons execution continues to be such an important leadership topic. It's execution that reveals whether communication was clear and whether accountability exists and whether people understand their roles. It also reveals whether priorities are actually priorities. What I know is that vision matters, strategy matters, culture matters, but eventually all leadership conversation runs to execution. Can people translate intention into action? Can they make decisions? Can they coordinate effectively? And frankly, can they just move the organization forward? Because when execution breaks down, leaders often discover that the issue wasn't effort, but it was clarity. And clarity may be one of the most undervalued leadership responsibilities. Another theme that keeps appearing in the podcast is that trust is not a cultural luxury. Trust is a performance variable. We often talk about trust as though it's something very soft, something that belongs in conversations about culture and engagement or relationships. Yet I think as you go back and listen through the podcast, many guests describe trust in operational terms because what we know is that trust affects speed, it affects collaboration, it affects innovation and decision making. When trust people share information more freely. They'll raise concerns earlier and take appropriate risk, and that all leads to solving problems faster. But when trust is low, everything becomes more expensive. Organizations end up compensating with additional meetings and more approvals and more oversight and additional layers of communication. And what happens is that people end up spending energy protecting themselves rather than advancing the mission. The organizations that consistently perform well seem to understand that trust is not separate from performance. Trust is the condition that makes performance possible. Another idea I've heard repeatedly is that growth creates complexity. Many organizations assume that growth will solve their problems. Well, sometimes it does, but more often than not, growth introduces new problems. Growth means more people, more systems, additional stakeholders, additional demands that tax on the system. And that the informal communication that worked really well with 20 employees may fail at 200. The leadership approaches that help create growth may not be the same approaches that are required to sustain. And we often see this with founders who are able to bring an organization to a certain point and then not help with its next growth stage. Several guests this year have talked about scale, and one message keeps surfacing. Growth does not eliminate complexity, but rather it creates complexity. And I think that's why leaders have to become increasingly intentional as organizations expand. The systems and communication patterns and leadership habits that probably once happened naturally often need to become much more deliberate. And finally, there's one idea that may be more relevant today than ever. And that is that uncertainty is no longer an interruption. For a long time, many organizations treated uncertainty as a temporary condition, something to manage until things return to normal. But normal, as everyone knows, has become a moving target. Technology continues to evolve. Just think about the changes with AI in the last 6 months. Markets will continue to shift. Customer expectations continue to change. And even, particularly since the global COVID-19 pandemic, the workplace itself continues to change. And I think the leaders who seem most effective aren't necessarily the ones with perfect answers, but rather they're the people who are helping others to stay grounded while navigating uncertainty. These are the leaders who are providing clarity where clarity is possible, who acknowledge ambiguity where ambiguity exists, and they really help people focus on what matters most. As I think back on the conversations we've had on the podcast, I'm reminded that leadership primarily isn't about authority. It's not about titles, and it's certainly not about having all of the answers. But leadership is about creating the conditions where people can do meaningful work together, conditions where trust exists, conditions where clarity exists, where accountability exists, where people understand how their contribution connects to something larger than themselves. And that's what the People Dividend has always been about. As we move into our August Encore series, I hope you'll listen for these themes, not because every guest sees leadership the same way, but because the strongest ideas tend to echo across industries, experiences, and perspectives. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing the People Dividend podcast. And thank you for being part of this community. This is the People Dividend. If you're serious about performance, start with people. Until we come back together in September, I hope you enjoy all of the encore episodes in August. And until we're back together again, stay well.